Hey there, everybody. Today is Thursday, March 31st. A few months ago, we spoke with Sean from Edible Acres during his winter consultation period, and part of me is really hopeful that he posts it up to their channel because I'd love to have it as a reference point to go back to in full. But part of me is also like, ooh, watching yourself talk to someone you hold in that high esteem. It's gonna feel weird. Either way, I felt like our conversation was particularly useful, and it got me thinking about a few things in sort of different contexts. And one of the things that we spoke about was ways to push the pulses of fertility on a site. And I think I have an almost fully rounded idea set, and I'd like to share some notes. So stick around. So, one of the ways that we discussed these pulses of fertility was overseeding. And this is a concept in lawn maintenance and standard suburbanite grass care. This is a way that we would apply, say, an over cover of wildflowers or overseeding clover into an existing lawn, so that we didn't have to go through the labor of ripping it all up and trying to replace it whole hog. We can kind of do like a frost seeding for clover when the grass is dormant to give the clover a leg up. So, in the same sense, when I'm doing plant work like splitting out Becky's, we can broadcast seed into the space we've disturbed as we put the mulch back over, and that'll help us bring even more biological activity to a wider section than just the one woody perennial that we're splitting out was bringing, right? And that got me kind of off on a thought pattern about information theory. Because really, DNA is the oldest known form of intergenerational information exchange. And if we can devote tons of time to thinking about how our garden's going to evolve and how information works, we should be able to come up with a way to describe some of these patterns that we're thinking about and have an overlap of efficacies. So when we're talking about information transmission, there are two ways that data can be transmitted. It can be synchronous or asynchronous, so it's being sent and read at the same time, or it is being sent and read at different times, right? And I mean, at its basest form, you would say something like, I planted a row of bulbs here. I come in and I can observe this one. At the initial sowing, I knew exactly where these were, and I knew exactly which plant was going to come up, if not the full percentage of which plants were going to come up, right? So that's synchronous. I'm getting feedback at the same time as I'm putting inputs into the system. Whereas asynchronous would be something like doing a mixed seed broadcast. So if I had a space up here that I had turned over and we did, say, a mixture of beans and brassicas and some wildflowers, I don't have an immediate feedback of what numbers of each. I don't have an idea of exactly where the seeds will land because they will bounce. There will be rain, there will be wind, there will be the potential for animals to move them, eat them, change their location, or just destroy them, right? So it'll take time for my input to be read by the system, and then for the system to have an output for me to read back as information from the system. So asynchronous. But then there's a third strategy that we've been employing, and it is an extremely asynchronous method that we've been using. So last year, just like I'm sure many of you did, we had chipmunks and mice from the woods, squirrels, groundhogs, porcupines are actually one of the animals that come through here and will eat a bunch of our plants. And so the habit is to think of them as pest species that don't bring a whole lot, and we can think of them as like, oh, they're manure inputs, or they are aerating the soil in the cases of voles and moles and things of that nature. And we can think of them as indicators of a healthy system. We can use them as indicators of whether it's going to be a good raptor year, or we can use them to see what the winter is going to be like, all of these things. But one of the other things that we can do is use their proclivity to take foodstuffs from us and disperse them. And so rather than thinking of them as pests, I've been thinking of them as interns. And by that I mean young and enthusiastic, and maybe not with all of the practical information I would want them to have at their disposal for immediate use, but with proper management and guidance, they can be some of our hardest workers and of huge assets to the system as a whole, not just in the immediate future, but going into long-term futures. So last year, as we had food losses from the garden beds over here, and then we noticed some food going off back into the woods. So one of the things that I did was take a portion of whatever spoiled produce or half-eaten tomatoes we had, and I would put them back in the woods down there near the pond, and I would just put this cache of food down there with a handful of other seeds and things that I had on hand that I could just afford to put out, right? Maybe they were reaching what I assumed was the end of their shelf life, or we had made, a different type of meal and I had seeds from another set of vegetables that were cool and new to me that I was considering growing. I'd stick a handful of those out with the cache of food, and as long as there wasn't the threat of a lot of snow the next day, that's what we would do. I never saw the food last for more than a couple of days, and even now, I see no piles of seeds. They're all pretty much gone. And my thinking is that this is the most asynchronous of planting strategies I could have come up with, right? I have one input, which is food trash goes down there somewhere, and with it, a pocket full of seeds of whatever species, doesn't matter which. As those wildlife critters go and disperse the seed into wherever, they are losing some portion of them, and those some portion will become an endemic species. And I can spend my time growing intentionally up here in some of the garden beds that we have. I can spend my time doing things in the garden spaces that we are cultivating. And those plants can be parts of our pulses of fertility, but they're going to express different phenotypes from the ones that are planted out in the woods that sprout. And so there's going to be these different genetic expressions of these plants' potential, and that is going to make for a wider genetic diversity above and beyond the standard genetic deviations that are present in seed-bearing plants. So, I'm not saying this is a strategy that everyone should employ. I'm not saying that you ought to do it. This might be a little too woo for some of you, but that's okay. This is really just a thought experiment. I have no outputs from the system yet, because this is such a synchronous information dispersal that I don't know if this really works or not, but I think it ought to. And so I'll be interested. I'll be keeping my eyes peeled. But what are some of the ways that you folks are going about your early seasonal work that is different from the norm? You know, what are you thinking is the next big step in your design? I'd love to know. I've got to figure out where those chickens got off to. Anyway, that's my thought. Till next time, thanks for watching. Happy planting. They are way off in the distance. Chook, 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 chook. Chook, 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 chook. That ought to get 'em.